Welcome to another video. In this one, we're going to be taking a look at some of the biggest changes to the Path of Exile passive skill tree going from Path of Exile 1 to Path of Exile 2. So let's just get straight into it with arguably the most interesting change on this list. That's the weapon skill tree passives. In Path of Exile 2, weapon swap will be incorporated into normal gameplay with a feature that allows you to select a weapon set that a particular ability will use whenever it's cast. For example, you can attach a staff which provides gem levels for fire abilities to your Firestorm skill, while you may want another weapon set which boosts the effectiveness of shocks that you inflict to be attached to your Spark skill. When you do this, casting one of those abilities will automatically swap to the weapon set that it's attached to, so that using that ability can benefit from the stats on that weapon. But as part of this feature, there will also be weapon skill tree passives, which are a portion of a character's total passive skill allocation, and this portion will come from skill books during the campaign. We don't know exactly how many of these you'll be able to obtain, but I suspect it will be somewhere around 20 or 25. These passive skill points are different from the ones you gain from leveling up, in that they can be attached to a weapon loadout to spec into a specific passive skill tree whenever that weapon set is active. This plays into the previously mentioned feature, allowing you to spec these weapon-specific passive points into nodes that will benefit that particular weapon set and the skills that it's attached to. I can imagine a melee character which is using a two-handed mace as an offensive set with a more defensive flail and shield combination in the other weapon swap. This character could then use their weapon passive skills to spec into a bunch of two-handed melee damage while the mace is active, and instead opt to spend points into nodes which provide more armor or chance to block while the defensive shield set is active. This feature is going to be part of the makeup of allowing builds in Path of Exile 2 to deviate from solely focusing on one archetype, allowing them to specialize into other options for use in specific scenarios. The next significant change between the two games is a character's starting location on the passive skill tree. In Path of Exile 1, there's a specific starting location for each class, which is dictated largely by the class attribute alignment and the archetype categories those classes fall into. Whilst there will still be a specific starting location for each class in Path of Exile 2, the location has been moved so that all classes start in the middle of the tree, with the facing location being defined once again by attribute and archetype alignment. Something to note here is the removal of the Scion class in Path of Exile 2. In PoE 1, the Scion starts right in the middle of the tree and can choose to leave the center in any direction they please. This class was designed as a jack of all trades and a way to close the gap on any potentially unsupported archetypes by allowing easy access to specific areas of the tree in exchange for a mostly weaker ascendancy. But the Scion is gone in PoE 2, and this is because they're adding 2 classes for each attribute alignment, which means that a total of 6 different ascendancy options would exist for every starting location on the passive skill tree, helping to solve the issue previously covered by the Scion. You may also notice that the middle section of the tree is also significantly changed, with no routes cutting straight through the middle portion of the tree. Jonathan mentioned that the layout of the tree in PoE 1 made it more difficult to balance because the middle section of the tree allowed a class to cut straight through and reach specific nodes on the opposite side of the tree. By removing this middle section of the tree, they feel that balancing the tree and the distance from class start location to specific keystones or clusters will be more straightforward. And speaking of balance, the third significant change between PoE 1 and PoE 2's passive skill trees is that Path of Exile 2's tree will have no life nodes. This decision to remove life nodes would have a giant impact on PoE 1 if it were to be implemented, but Path of Exile 2 is being designed from the beginning to have no life nodes on the tree, and this design decision actually makes a lot of sense when you think about it. By doing this, they can better balance how much life an average character will have, which will largely be defined by gear choices, and presumably the life gain from leveling up might be a bit higher as a result of this change. Meanwhile, on the passive skill tree, the space freed up from having no life nodes, which by the way is a lot of life nodes on the Path of Exile 1 tree, this space can be used for more specific character defensive investment, which is one of their goals of this change, allowing a character to use those points to specialize into defensive mechanics which make sense for the build they're playing. Things like armor or evasion scaling, block, spell suppression, or energy shield. Another significant change is that Path of Exile 2's passive skill tree will have no masteries, at least not to begin with. But just like the design of having no life nodes on the passive skill tree, the concept of having no masteries is something which makes sense in the context of PoE 2. After all, the passive tree mastery system was originally implemented as a way to solve the issue of having very niche, distinctive build-enabling mechanics locked away in specific areas of the tree, by allowing such stats to become optionally available from any relevant wheel that a build could access. But Path of Exile 2's skill system is being designed from the beginning to be very different, with expressive abilities which combo off one another, and the support gem system which limits a character to one copy of a support gem. It makes sense that these more niche offensive mechanics would exist on the abilities themselves, or the more specialized support gems that can augment them. We know that PoE 2's support gem system is going to have a lot less damage-focused supports, and whilst damage multipliers or flat damage supports will still exist, they'll be available alongside more interesting and specific options to augment an ability, providing that level of niche support to enable a particular setup which won't be tied to a specific area on the passive skill tree. Another significant change is that Path of Exile 2's travel nodes will be stat selectable, providing lower but typically more meaningful stats. When selecting a travel node, you'll be able to choose between +5 dexterity, +5 strength, and +5 intelligence, helping you to meet stat requirements for gear or abilities much more easily. This change is actually massive for leveling, especially considering that gem socket colors are gone too, so you'll be able to much more easily level how you'd like without being prohibited by your attributes or your gear sockets. And the final significant change we're going to discuss in this video is once again to do with a class's starting location, because in Path of Exile 2, this starting area will actually change based on the class your character is, to provide more relevant stats for either its location on the overall tree, or the supporting archetypes of your chosen class. For example, the Witch and Sorceress will both begin at the most northern facing position on the tree, but each of these classes will have a different copy of this starting area. For the Sorceress, this area will presumably be filled with things like elemental damage, perhaps mana or energy shield options and things like this. Meanwhile, for the Witch, they'll have options like minion damage and chaos damage over time. Same location on the tree, but different nodes based on chosen class. However, there is also a third copy of this starting location which will exist for every other class which didn't start at this location on the tree. For example, a warrior travelling to the top of the tree will find different nodes in this area compared to a witch that started there. And this decision to modify the starting area actually came about due to an issue with providing stats that any player beginning at that starting location would actually want. Jonathan mentioned that if they provided a node which had a stat that the player wanted and one that they didn't want, the player generally didn't want to spec into that node, and it created decision paralysis as a result. By modifying the tree on a per-class basis for the starting locale, they can better provide useful stats that the player wants to choose. Meanwhile, there was also the interesting problem of how much of a stat a starting node provides. Jonathan said that having a starting node be useful for other classes moving into that area of the tree whilst also providing meaningful boosts to players beginning at that location on the tree was difficult to balance. So by having a third copy which only exists for players moving over to that area of the tree, they can provide stats which are more relevant in terms of power level, compared to a character starting here and taking these nodes as their first few skill points spent. And there you have it, the key differences between the Path of Exile 1 and Path of Exile 2 passive skill trees. Let me know what you think about these changes in the comment section below, and which change, if any, are you most excited about? For me, it's definitely those weapon tree passive skills. What an incredible feature that may end up being. And thank you for watching this video, and thank you for your ongoing support. As always, stay tuned and stay safe.